Went camping with my parents and my brother's family, trying to give my daughter one quiet weekend away from the grief that had been swallowing us whole. But after a short walk with my 10-year-old girl, we came back to an empty clearing. The people, the tents, the food, the cars, gone. No cell service, no footprints that made sense. Just a note on the table that said, "This is for the best. Trust me." That was the moment I realized my own family had left us to die in the forest. And 10 days later, they regretted every second of it. My name is Zion, and this is the story I never thought I'd live long enough to tell. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if what I'm about to share moves you or makes you feel something, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm Zion, and this is what survival really looked like. My name is Zion Wilder. I'm 31, and for most of my adult life I've hidden behind work like it was armor. I built Wilder Notes from a messy idea in my garage into an app used in hospitals across the state, but none of that ever mattered as much as raising my 10-year-old daughter, Nova. 6 months ago, when my wife Maya died, the world turned flat. Not dark, not dramatic, just empty, like someone had scraped all the color out of it. Nova was the only thing keeping me from collapsing into that hollow space. She didn't cry much, not in front of me anyway, but every now and then I'd catch her staring at the spot on the couch where Maya used to sit, as if she could still see her. My family noticed I wasn't pulling myself together the way they thought a man should. Victor. My father liked to pretend he understood grief, even though he never stayed long enough in anyone's life to witness it. Sylvia, my stepmother, was polite in a way that felt like she was always editing herself. And Lennox, my half-brother, carried that permanent sense of superiority he'd perfected since childhood. Harlow, his wife, was the kind of person who smiled with her teeth, but never with her eyes. I'd spent years trying to pretend we were a normal family, but the truth was simpler. I'd always been the one standing slightly outside the frame. So when they suggested a family camping trip at Bridger Teton National Forest, my first instinct was to say no. I told Victor it wasn't a good time, that Nova had school projects, that I had deadlines. He cut me off with, "You need to open up again, son." Sylvia followed with, "Nova will love the fresh air." They made it sound like a rescue mission. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But Nova's face lit up when she overheard, and that was enough to make me agree despite the knot tightening in my chest. The days leading up to the trip were a blur of packing and second-guessing. Nova kept bringing me little things she wanted: to take her sketchbook, a flashlight shaped like a fox, the photo of Maya she kept in her drawer. I slipped my own photo of Maya into my backpack when Nova wasn't looking. As I zipped up the bag, a strange feeling tightened across my ribs. Something about this trip felt off. A rhythm slightly out of sync. I ignored it, told myself I was projecting, told myself grief had rewired my instincts. But then an email arrived from Wilder Notes' internal security system. "Your access permissions have been modified." No explanation, no context. I checked again, refreshed the page, but the alert disappeared as if nothing had happened. I assumed it was a software glitch. Those happened sometimes after updates, but part of me froze, a quiet, cold awareness sliding down my spine. I shut my laptop and refused to think about it again. The morning we left, I loaded Nova into the SUV and looked back at the house, our house. But it suddenly felt like I was stepping out of one world and into another. I kept telling myself it was just a family trip, a weekend meant to help me breathe again. But as our tires left the asphalt and rolled toward the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was carrying more than bags and firewood with me. I was carrying unspoken tensions, old wounds, and a suspicion I couldn't name. I didn't know that I was walking straight into the moment my life would split cleanly into a before and an after. Bridger Teton opened in front of us like a painting, lakes smooth as glass, peaks still dusted with late snow, and tall pines swaying as if greeting us. Nova was out of the car before I even turned off the engine, running toward the clearing with a brightness I hadn't seen in months. Her laugh echoed into the trees, and for a moment, just a moment, I let myself relax. Everyone acted warmer than I expected. Victor clapped me on the back as if we weren't still carrying decades of unresolved tension. Sylvia unpacked food with a serene smile. Lennox joked with Nova, lifting her onto his shoulders. Even Harlow seemed easier, making small talk while untangling rope for the tarps. It almost looked like a family I recognized, one I used to imagine we could be. But little cracks formed the longer I observed them. When I asked Lennox how his company was doing, he avoided eye contact and changed the subject. Sylvia leaned close to Victor, whispering sharply until they noticed I was near, then abruptly stopped. I tried to focus on teaching Nova how to build a small fire pit. Yet every time I glanced over my shoulder, I caught Lennox watching me, not with brotherly affection, but with a calculating expression, like he was assessing something he wasn't ready to say. At dinner, they talked about moving forward, new beginnings, clean slates. I nodded along, assuming they were trying to encourage me, but the tone was strange too, rehearsed, too final. Like they were preparing themselves for an ending that hadn't been spoken aloud. After we finished eating Nova, and Max chased fireflies while the adults lingered around the fire. That was when Harlow leaned toward me, her voice soft but sharp around the edges. "At least you won't have to carry everything alone forever," she murmured. There was something in her tone, certainty, maybe pity, maybe something else entirely, that made my skin tighten. I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled and stood up as if she hadn't said anything unusual at all. I tried to shake it off and focus on Nova. She was standing by the fire, roasting a marshmallow with both hands, squinting in concentration. Seeing her like that, healthy, alive, hopeful, punched a hole through the grayness that had swallowed me since Maya died. Remembered nights when the three of us sat by the fireplace at home, and for a second I felt like I could breathe again. Later in our tent, Nova fell asleep almost instantly, curled against my side. I listened to her soft breathing, the steady hush of wind brushing against the canvas, and a fragile peace settled over me. Maybe I had judged my family too harshly. Maybe they were trying in their own imperfect way. But that thought faded the moment I stepped outside to get water. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and the moonlight revealed a trail of footprints leading toward the northern woods. They were deeper, larger, and angled in a direction none of us had walked. When I pointed them out the next morning, Lennox brushed it off, saying a ranger probably passed through. His tone was tight, his jaw clenched, and something in me snapped into alertness. I didn't know it then, but those footprints were the first sign that the weekend wasn't what they said it was. That whatever they were planning, I was walking straight toward it without a clue. Nova woke me before sunrise, tapping my shoulder with that eager determination only a 10-year-old can hold. She wanted to see the morning light from the overlook I'd pointed out the day before. Part of me wanted to stay wrapped in the thin warmth of the sleeping bag, away from the cold and the weight sitting on my chest, but she was already lacing her boots, her hair messy, her eyes bright. I nodded and followed her out into the crisp air. The trail was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're walking into a sacred place. When we reached the overlook, the sky opened up in shades of gold, and rose the sun pushing through a spread of clouds like it was tearing them apart. Nova stood on the rocks with her hands tucked under her chin, breathing in the cold morning. Then she said she wondered if her mom could see the same sunrise from wherever she was. Her voice didn't shake, but mine did when I answered. She leaned into me, and we stood like that for a long moment. For the first time since Maya died, I let myself believe maybe my family had brought us here for the right reasons. Maybe I had misjudged them. But the moment shattered the second we returned to camp. We stepped through the line of trees and everything was gone. Not disturbed, not shifted. Gone. The tents, the coolers, the chairs, the fire pit stones, the cars, every trace of them had vanished as if they had been lifted straight out of the earth. Only one thing remained, Nova's small backpack, half unzipped, sitting in the dirt like it had been placed there deliberately. My breath snapped in my chest. I spun around, searching for movement, for sound, for anything that could tell me this was a mistake. On the flat stone table in the middle of the clearing was a single sheet of paper pinned under a smooth river rock. I lifted it with numb fingers. The handwriting was Lennox's. "This is for the best. Trust me." 10 words. 10 words that cracked open a silence so loud I could hear my pulse in my ears. Nova grabbed my hand and asked what it meant. I didn't answer because I didn't know how. My mind was scrambling, racing through possibilities. Maybe they went for help, maybe they had an emergency, maybe this was some sick joke, but none of them held up. None of them explained why our belongings were gone. None explained why only Nova's bag remained. Then I noticed the ground. Along the clearing's edge were tire tracks heading away from the site, but not toward the main road. They veered into a direction I didn't recognize, deeper into the forest rather than out of it. And near the tracks, half buried in dirt, was a small plastic card. A room key from a hotel in Jackson Hole. Not one any of us had used. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the plastic warm against my palm. My stomach dropped. Someone else had been here. Someone who shouldn't have been. Nova tugged my sleeve, her eyes wide. She asked if they were coming back. I told her I wasn't sure, but the truth pressed hard against my ribs. They weren't. They had left us here deliberately, and whatever reason they thought justified it. It had nothing to do with helping me heal. The moment I understood we were alone, something inside me shifted. The grief, the confusion, the shock they had to move aside. I didn't have room for anything except survival and the instinct to protect my daughter. I went through what little we had left: Nova's half-empty water bottle, my pocket knife, a lighter, one jacket, and a few scraps of food. Not enough to last even 2 days. My brain calculated possibilities, directions, distances. I forced myself to breathe evenly so Nova wouldn't see the fear creeping up my spine. The only logical path was the stream that ran along the back of the clearing. Water meant direction, and direction meant hope. Bridger Teton was too massive to follow instinct alone. Streams often led to larger bodies of water, and larger bodies of water meant trails, cabins, or other people. I told Nova we were going to walk along the water. She nodded, trusting me in a way that hurt to look at. By late afternoon, we'd made a small camp beside the stream. I taught her to filter water with charcoal from a burned log and strips of fabric from my shirt. She asked me why the family had left us. I tried to answer, but nothing sounded true, not even to me. That night she fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake listening to every sound. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful. On the second day, our energy thinned. My legs shook under the weight of the backpack. Nova began slowing down, her feet dragging over the rocks. I found a cluster of berries that looked familiar, but I checked every detail against the foraging rules Maya once taught me. If I got it wrong, we'd both pay. I handed Nova a few and pocketed the rest for later. When we continued moving, I spotted a scrap of fabric caught on a branch near the stream, a piece of an old handkerchief torn, recently smeared with fresh mud. It wasn't ours. Someone else had come through this way not long before us. On the third day, the sky darkened early. Rain hammered the treetops, turning the ground slick. I was searching for shelter when Nova grabbed my arm, pointing at deep claw marks carved into a pine trunk. A black bear. Too close. I lifted her and climbed a low, wide branch, pressing her against me as I held on with one arm. The bear moved below us, sniffing, pacing, rustling the underbrush. I didn't breathe until it disappeared into the distance. When we climbed down, I saw large human footprints in the mud near the stream. They weren't aligned with the tire tracks from the campsite. They were headed in the opposite direction. It made no sense unless someone else had been traveling the forest with purpose. On the fourth day, Nova woke shivering. Her skin flushed, her eyes glassy. Fever. We had no medicine. I searched desperately for willow bark, breaking off strips and boiling them in a tin cup I'd found near the stream. I gave her sips, praying it would help. Every minute that passed made the panic claw deeper into my ribs, but I kept my face calm. She needed steady, not scared. On the fifth day, we stumbled upon a ranger cabin tucked between dense pines. The door hung crooked, one hinge nearly broken. Inside was the stale smell of mold dust and old rain. The shelves were half collapsed, the radio on the desk smashed. But we found a few supplies: salt, a cracked pot, metal scraps, and old matches that still sparked after enough attempts. When I lit a small fire, Nova slept for hours. While she did, I noticed dark writing on the back wall, smeared as though made with burnt wood. The message read, "Don't trust the one you came with." A chill ran through me. Whoever wrote it hadn't been gone long. The next day, while searching the cabin drawers, I found a folded receipt from a hotel in Jackson Hole. The signature scrawled at the bottom looked disturbingly similar to Sylvia's handwriting. I stared at it until the edges blurred. She had been here, or someone connected to her. Either way, this trip was more than a casual family outing. There were layers I hadn't understood. That night I laid Nova beside the fire and watched her chest rise and fall. Every sound outside the cabin made me flinch. I realized then that the forest wasn't just wilderness, it was hiding secrets, movements, intentions I didn't yet understand. And whatever my family had done, they weren't the only danger we had walked into. The fight for our lives had barely begun. Leaving the cabin was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but I knew it couldn't protect us forever. The walls were thin, the roof sagged, and every creak in the wood made me feel like the forest itself was warning me not to stay still. Nova was too weak to walk far, so I lifted her onto my back, tied her arms gently around my shoulders, and carried what little we had salvaged from the cabin. Her breath was warm against my neck, too warm, and I kept telling myself she just needed rest, warmth, and time. By midday, the trees thinned just enough for me to see smoke drifting lazily above a ridge in the distance. It was faint, almost invisible unless you stared directly at it, but it was undeniably there. Proof of human life. Or danger. Or both. I couldn't tell. I didn't dare get too hopeful, yet I also couldn't look away. I marked the direction in my mind, planning each careful step. Nova, half awake, gathered a few smooth stones and arranged them into a simple arrow on the ground when we paused to rest. She said she didn't want us to lose our way if we had to turn back. Her determination broke me open and kept me moving at the same time. We continued through a maze of pines until I spotted a bright red strap under a fallen log. I kicked aside the branches and uncovered a first aid kit, the kind issued in high-end outdoor packs. It was almost untouched. Inside were bandages, antibiotics, and supplies that could save a life. A folded card fell into my hand as I rummaged through it. When I opened it, my stomach tightened. It was a gym membership card with Lennox's name on it. The forest suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the trees were listening. That night the wind shifted colder than before. The next morning it carried needles of snow, signaling the beginning of a light mountain storm. I spotted a crevice in a rock formation large enough to shield us, so I helped Nova inside and crouched next to her. The walls bore long, straight cuts, unnatural and too clean, as though someone had used a saw blade to carve out space. That strange sense from the cabin returned. Someone had lived here before us, or used it for reasons I didn't want to imagine. As we set out again, I found footprints along the riverbed. They were deep, wide, and angled outward slightly, someone tall with a minor foot imbalance. They appeared again and again along the route, getting fresher the farther we walked. Whoever left them was not part of my family. They were ahead of us, moving with purpose, and the idea that someone else might be in the forest for reasons unknown made my nerves hum painfully. In the crevice tucked behind a stone, I found a crumpled page torn from a notebook. The handwriting slanted sharply as if written in a rush. It read, "If they tell you to trust them, don't." I read it again and again, the meaning sinking heavier each time. My family hadn't just abandoned me. Someone else had been caught in their orbit before someone who had tried to warn whoever found the note next. A sense of dread settled deep in my bones. I knew then that whoever this missing person was, they had been running from something connected to my family long before I walked into the forest. On the 9th day, Nova collapsed. There was no warning. She simply wilted in my arms, her legs giving out, her head falling against my chest. I carried her through bitter wind, speaking to her even when she couldn't answer, begging her to stay awake. Every step felt like a lifetime, and every breath burned like ice. I kept thinking how the first time I held her was in a hospital room, clean and bright, with Maya crying and laughing at the same time. Now I was holding her the same way, except the world around us was cold, merciless, and determined to swallow us. When I found the second ranger station on the 10th day, my body nearly gave out from relief. It was barely standing, but it had a roof, a broken radio, old newspapers, and scorch marks from past fires. On the desk, someone had pressed their palm into soot and dragged it across the wood, leaving a streaked message spelled out with a finger. "Go east." The letters were uneven, smudged, desperate. It felt like the person had run out of time. I gathered wood-tore strips from the old newspaper, stacked everything into a large shape on the ground, and set it alight. The smoke billowed thick and dark, rising above the tree line. Hours passed before the distant chop of helicopter blades cut through the wind. When the aircraft finally circled above us and the rescue crew lowered a harness, I held Nova tightly as they lifted her first, her small body dangling above the trees. For the first time in 10 days, I let myself believe we might live. But as I watched them pull her into the cabin of the helicopter, I also knew this was only the beginning. The forest had shown me the truth. Now I had to face the people who put us there. I woke to the smell of disinfectant, the faint beep of machinery, and a sharp ache in my chest, as if I'd swallowed all the tension of the last 10 days. The hospital lights were too bright, the sheets too white, the silence too clean. Nova lay beside me in a separate bed, an IV and her arm color returning to her cheeks. Relief hit me so hard I nearly sobbed. But before I could fully take in the safety of the moment, a man in a dark suit appeared at the foot of my bed, his badge flashing under the fluorescent lights. He introduced himself as a federal agent and said he needed to discuss the circumstances of my disappearance. He handed me a document, an official missing person report filed by Lennox. The report stated that I had walked into the forest voluntarily with my daughter, overwhelmed by grief, in an unstable state of mind. According to his statement, I had left the campsite during the night. Reading that lie made something heavy settle in my stomach. They hadn't just abandoned me, they'd tried to erase me. The agent then showed me a will dated 2 weeks before the trip. It named Lennox and one of his affiliated companies as the primary inheritors of my estate and Wilder notes. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. The fingerprint smudges resembled my own, but none of it was real. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Fabricated, designed, perfectly timed. He pulled out a tablet next and played a video. My face appeared on screen, speaking words I didn't remember saying, about feeling like I wanted to disappear, about being unable to go on. But the lighting was wrong. My voice carried a strange tone, and the cuts between sentences felt unnatural. It was built from a podcast interview I'd done years ago, edited until the message was twisted into something darker. Harlow had submitted it to authorities, claiming it proved my instability. My throat tightened as I watched myself speak things I had never said. Next came the financial records. The agent explained that within 48 hours of my disappearance, temporary control of my assets had shifted to Lennox. Large withdrawals were made from business accounts and moved into a private holding under a disguised name. They had been preparing for this long before the trip. Then he told me something I didn't expect. 2 months before I disappeared, a ranger assigned to the same region had gone missing. His notes recovered from the station he worked at included observations about suspicious activity tied to a corporation registered under Victor's name. One of his handwritten pages matched the fragment I found in the crevice almost exactly. That meant someone else had been fighting the same enemy before I ever set foot in the woods. The realization settled over me slowly, but unmistakably. My family's plan wasn't an emotional outburst or a desperate mistake. It was structured, layered, practiced. Someone else had already tried to expose whatever they were doing and vanished in the attempt. The forest wasn't the trap. It was the cover. I looked at the agent and told him I would give every detail, every breadcrumb, every sign I'd seen. I would not let them rewrite my story. I would not let them bury what they had done. And as the words left my mouth, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not grief, resolve. I was done surviving quietly. I was ready to make them answer for everything. Recovering in the hospital didn't feel like healing. It felt like waiting for another kind of impact. Once Nova was stable and my own body began to respond to rest, the real work started. I spent days sitting with agents from the FBI, my attorney, and the handwriting forensic team. Every meeting felt like stepping back into the forest, except this time I wasn't fighting cold or hunger, but secrets, lies, and the heavy weight of evidence. I collected everything I could: old text messages from Lennox, voice recordings in which he talked about cleaning up loose ends, email logs showing unauthorized access to my company accounts, photos I took of the cabin, the soot-covered message, the torn journal page, the Jackson Hole receipt. Each piece looked small on its own. but together they formed a map of a crime more deliberate than anything I'd imagined. The night before the first interrogation, fear pressed hard against my ribs. I had survived the wilderness, but the idea of facing my family again made my hands shake. I reminded myself that this wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. It was about Nova. And it was about the ranger who'd vanished months before us, someone who had tried to expose what my family was hiding long before I stumbled into it. Walking into the prosecutor's office felt like stepping onto a stage with no script. Victor sat stiff-backed, Sylvia clutched a tissue she didn't need. Lennox leaned back like he owned the room, and Harlow crossed her arms, watching me with a smirk she didn't bother hiding. None of them looked sorry. They looked annoyed, inconvenienced, like I was a problem that had come back from the dead. We began with the evidence, and the first strike landed quickly. I placed the Jackson Hole hotel receipt on the table, Sylvia's looping signature at the bottom. The prosecutor spelled out clearly that the receipt was dated the morning they abandoned us. Sylvia's face drained of color, her hand trembling as she tried to swallow. For the first time, I saw fear flicker through her composure. Then came the video. A digital forensic expert explained how the clip submitted by Harlow had been altered using AI tools to make it appear I was speaking about wanting to vanish. As he walked the room through the manipulated frames showing the mismatched lighting and irregular audio frequencies, Harlow's confidence cracked. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers shook and she looked away when the prosecutor asked her to explain why she'd submitted doctored evidence under oath. Next were the bank statements. The prosecutor slid them across the table toward Lennox, the numbers printed in stark black showing exactly when and how he withdrew over $200,000 immediately after my disappearance. His excuses fell apart the more he spoke. He stuttered, contradicted himself, and finally went silent when the prosecutor asked why he moved the money into a hidden account only days after filing my missing person report. Then the FBI presented the most devastating piece, the torn journal pages recovered from the rocky crevice. The handwriting expert confirmed with high probability that they belonged to the missing ranger Jared Miles. The notes described his investigation into Victor's business operations and suspicious activity in Bridger Teton. The room shifted. Even Harlow stopped breathing for a moment. The words made it clear Jared had discovered something dangerous, something he believed involved my family, something he didn't live long enough to reveal in full. Victor tried to speak, then shifting blame to Lennox, claiming that grief over Maya had made me unstable, that he had only tried to intervene before tragedy happened. I met his eyes and felt something inside me steady. I told him plainly, "You didn't save me. You planned for me not to return." The silence that followed was sharp. And that was when Sylvia finally broke. She began crying real tears this time and confessed she had known about the plan to leave us in the forest. She claimed she didn't realize how long we would be out there. She said Victor promised everything would be handled cleanly, that someone else had already taken care of things before. I knew she was talking about Jared, even if she didn't say the name. By the end of the session, the air felt heavy with things that could no longer be denied. When the prosecutor finally stood and announced that the evidence was sufficient to pursue criminal charges against all four of them, I felt the floor shift beneath me, not with victory, but with a kind of exhausted relief. As I left the room, I understood this wasn't the end. It was the moment before the storm broke open. The courthouse felt colder than the forest ever had. As I stepped into the courtroom for the first day of the trial, I felt the weight of every moment that led me here. Nova hugged me before I walked in, whispering that she'd be okay waiting in the hallway. I carried her voice with me as I faced the room where my family's fate and the truth would finally be decided. The jury sat with measured expressions, the judge watched with a keen, steady gaze, and the prosecutors arranged their files with a precision that felt almost surgical. When they began presenting their case, they delivered it like a story that had been waiting too long to be told. The forged will with my forged signature, the altered video, the unauthorized financial transfers, the Jackson Hole receipt, the torn pages from Jared's journal. They didn't portray my family as desperate or misguided. They portrayed them as architects of a layered plan built on lies, fraud, and deliberate abandonment. Then something unexpected happened. A new witness took the stand, the manager of the Jackson Hole Hotel. He testified that Victor had rented 2 rooms the morning after the supposed family trip began and had paid extra to ensure none of the staff logged who checked in. Hearing that stripped away any remaining doubt. Victor had left the campsite intentionally. He had separated himself from us long before the morning they abandoned me and Nova. The next blow came from the GPS logs of Victor's SUV. The FBI presented the data showing the vehicle leaving the forest along a rarely used service path, intentionally avoiding main roads and traffic cameras. This confirmed that they hadn't left by accident or in a panic. They'd executed a planned departure designed to leave no trace. When the prosecutors shifted to Jared Miles, the courtroom shifted with them. Jared had been investigating suspicious shipments tied to Victor's company before he disappeared. His notes mentioned feeling watched, pressured, and threatened. He vanished just weeks after documenting these concerns. The jury leaned forward. Everyone understood the implication, even if no one said it aloud. This wasn't the first time someone got too close to the truth. When it was my turn to speak, I wasn't angry. I wasn't trembling. I told the court what happened, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a father who carried his unconscious daughter through snow and darkness because the people who should have cared the most chose to leave us behind. I spoke of the cabin, the soot-written message telling us to go east the days Nova drifted in and out of consciousness, the moment I realized I might have to bury her in the forest if help didn't come. I told them I felt like I had died twice, once when Maya left me, and once when my family walked away without a backward glance. The judge instructed the jury, and after days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the verdicts were read. Lennox guilty on charges of attempted murder, fraud, endangerment of a minor, and falsifying legal documents, 18 years. Harlow guilty of submitting doctored evidence and aiding the cover-up, 10 years. Victor guilty of conspiracy, financial manipulation, and orchestrating the abandonment, 15 years. Sylvia guilty of participation, but granted reduced sentencing due to cooperation, 6 years of supervised release. There was no applause, no celebration, just a quiet shifting of air as if the room itself exhaled. When I walked out of the courtroom, Nova ran into my arms. She whispered, "We don't need them anymore." And for the first time, I believed it. We moved to Helena, Montana a month later, settling into a small house near the mountains. Nova took up drawing, filling page after page with scenes of trees, rivers, and a man carrying a child through the dark. I started writing a book after the clearing, to tell the story the way it deserved to be told. I ended it with one truth I had learned the hard way. I wasn't the missing man they tried to erase. I was the survivor they never expected to face again. And sometimes losing your family is the first step toward finally finding yourself. After the trial ended and the noise around my story began to fade, I found myself standing on the porch of our small Helena home, watching the evening settle over the mountains. The quiet felt different now, no longer threatening, no longer a reminder of the forest that almost became our grave. This quiet felt earned. It felt like the kind that comes after surviving something no one should have to survive. I often think about the moment the helicopter lifted Nova out of those trees, how her small hand reached for me even when she was barely conscious. That image stayed with me through every courtroom hearing, every testimony, every piece of evidence that cut deeper than any wound I suffered out there. And now, when I look at her painting by the window, humming to herself, I realize we didn't just escape the forest, we escaped a life that was never meant for us. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my family. The truth is complicated. I miss the idea of them, the version I held on to for so long, believing they would someday care the way families are supposed to. But the reality nearly killed us. Letting go wasn't a choice. It was a survival instinct. And in that letting go, I discovered something unexpected. There is strength in building a life from scratch, in choosing peace over blood ties, and deciding that who you become matters more than where you came from. If you've listened to my story this far, I want to thank you. Stories like mine aren't easy to hear, and they're even harder to tell. But sharing it reminds me that what we survived wasn't for nothing, that every step, every breath, every fear-filled night meant something. And if my voice reaches even one person who feels alone, abandoned, or silenced, then maybe this story can do more than reopen old wounds. Maybe it can help someone else find their way out of their own forest.